Okay, thanks, Samir. Okay, so I want to start by paying homage to Jack Smith. Jack, in some ways, was the person who got me involved in a lot of this work. I did a consulting project, a small consulting project for him with David Arthur's back around 1997, and subsequently Jack became the godfather / eminence grise for the Innovation Systems Research Network that I led, directed for about 12 or 13 years. We did two big shirk projects as part of that, and I've followed Jack's career since then, and have been a big fan of what he's done, but am also personally very much in his debt for the opportunities he gave me to do some research. I want to just preface what I'm about to say with a couple of brief remarks. I finished most of the slides on Tuesday. I spent the last day and a half prepping myself. And I did two things in particular that fed into what I'm going to talk about today. I don't know whether anyone has seen this or subscribes to the Logic, which is an online tech-devoted newsletter. But they put something out yesterday, which is what the quote-unquote tech community is asking for in the federal budget. And that's probably one of the most depressing things I've read. If anyone here contributed to any of the budget submissions that were summarized in that piece, I apologize, but it was pretty depressing reading what the Logic considers to be needed tech policy. And you'll see when we get to the end of this presentation, the difference between what they were talking about and what I'm going to talk about. But the second thing I did is I spent an hour and a half this morning on a webinar from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation out of DC, run by Rob Atkinson, who's also an acquaintance. They had a panel on the two acts that are currently making their way through the Senate and House of Commons. The Senate bill is called the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, and the House bill is called the American Competes Act. They both pretty much made their way through the respective houses of Congress, and they're heading for conference to try to reconcile the differences sometime over the next few months. And the expectation was that these bills, the combined bill or the reconciled bill may very well get passed by both houses of Congress before the end of this year. And listening to some discussion, which I'll refer to along the way, it just reminded me of a view that I've long had of Canadian science, technology, and innovation policy. Yeah, it often reminds me an awful lot of the French generals preparing for the beginning of World War II against Germany by strengthening the defenses of the Maginot Line as the German panzer divisions were organizing and preparing to do a lightning strike through Belgium and completely surround the French generals. We seem to constantly be in this country fighting the last technology battle. I don't think we have a real serious strategic technology foresight capability in the federal government, and I think it seriously limits our ability to devise and implement effective innovation policy. Particularly, we don't pay nearly enough attention to what's going on in other parts of the world, the US, China, the EU, Japan, South Korea even. And I think it really means that what we consider to be leading edge or cutting innovation policy is stuff that other countries have done years ago or other countries have considered and are not even bothering with. And I'll try to explain that as I go. A brief overview of what I want to cover in the presentation. The first few slides deal with the acceleration of the digital economy. This is part, I would call the foresight part of the presentation. I'm drawing on a few things I've seen and heard over the last few years that give me a very strong sense of urgency about the kinds of things I'm going to talk about today. The second part of the presentation, the major part of the presentation, draws on the report of the Council of Canadian Academies that Peter referred to, the report produced in 2018, called Competing in the Global Innovation Economy, and I'm using some of the slides from that report to present an overview of the relative performance of the Canadian R&D system and why the council characterized it as a relatively weak system. Then I'm going to go on and talk briefly about why has Canada failed to innovate. I'm borrowing from some people who probably know a lot more about this than I do. I have a slide along the way that I stole from Peter Nicholson, and I have one that I've taken a couple of slides from Travis, and then I've modified or amended one with some stuff that Dave Waters likes to use in his presentations. And then I want to end up with an overview of where I think we should be heading, and I'm going to draw upon 3 reports that I've produced over the last couple of years. The first is a report for the Institute for Research on Public Policy that's available on their website. The second is a paper on scale-up firms that I did with Travis and a postdoc student, Stephen Denny, that's available on the IPL website. And then the last thing is a report that I just finished for ISED on the platform economy and competition policy in Canada. I'm still waiting for permission from ISED to go and post that as an IPL working paper, but I'm hoping it will be up very shortly. It's part of their ongoing review of competition policy that the minister has been mandated to undertake by the Prime Minister. All right, so starting with the foresight part, this is a slide that I've been using for a while in most presentations. I've been doing very simple. The message is quite obvious. We are living in an age of exponential growth. Exponential means that both the rate of change and the rate of increase in the rate of change are accelerating at the same time. If you can see my arrow, the gap between a linear rate of growth and an exponential rate of growth creates both destructive stresses and opportunities. We use this graphic in our project on creating digital opportunity that Peter referred to. But the other point I often make is that public policy, for those of us who study in public policy and who've worked in public policy tends to change at a linear rate of growth, not an exponential rate of growth. And particularly the institutions that public policy makers either work in or need to create to implement their policies definitely change at a linear rate rather than exponential rate. And this, we're seeing this right now in the platform economy that I will talk about at the end of the presentation, and this creates enormous stresses and pressures.
David, sorry to interrupt you, but your slides are not showing yet. So if you could post your slides.
I did. They're not showing.
No.
Okay, I have to go back. Sorry.
Just your first slide, I think.
Okay, I think when I changed to what happened, Peter, I think is when I changed.
We lost it when you press record.
It's coming now. There it is. You got it.
Okay, yeah, I lost it when I pressed record. Okay, so that's the slide on linear versus exponential growth. And the next slide is on the acceleration of a digital economy. I will, in talking about innovation, I'm heavily biased towards digital technology because that's what I've spent the last 30 to 40 years working on. It's what I know best. I recognize and understand it's not the only technology, but I also increasingly am of the view that it is a foundational technology. Brian Arthur has a really interesting short paper from about 7 or 8 years ago where he talks about the digital infrastructure as the truly second industrial revolution. We're seeing it in the development of platforms. The initial cost of developing them can be quite high, but subsequent costs are quite low. The economics of information that Hal Varian started analyzing in the 1990s before he got scooped by Google, creates unique advantages. We've seen it in the work on the increasing work on intangible investments, both by Haskell and Stan Westlake, and the OECD has picked up that theme in quite a number of recent publications. And of course, it's a favorite whipping horse for Jim Balsillie. Every time he presents on Parliament Hill, he makes a point about the critical importance of tangible investments. And their essential property is their scalability. They can be accessed from multiple sites and by large numbers of users simultaneously. But platforms scale more efficiently due to what we call network effects, coming from the work of Brian Arthur and Paul David. And then I'd like to make a point that I really got from Thomas Friedman, who I'm normally not a big fan of, but his book, Thank You for Being Late, really opened my eyes about something. Friedman regards 2007 as a critical inflection point in the growth of the digital economy. For anybody who follows it, that is important because it was the year of the introduction of the first iPhone. It led to a rapid proliferation of mobile devices, caught Canada's leading technology company at the time, RIM, completely off guard. I've read, I think in Sean Silkoff's book about BlackBerry, Mike Lazaridis refused to take the iPhone seriously because the battery wouldn't last for a full day, and Lazaridis couldn't believe anybody would want to own a phone where the battery didn't last for a day. So that's probably one of the classic misjudgments in Canadian technology history. Ranks along up there with Nortel that Peter's done a lot of work on. But the proliferation of mobile devices and the growth of what people call the app economy is only one part of it. We have increased networking bandwidth, the spread of cloud computing that John Zeisman at Berkeley's done a ton of work on, the growing adaptability of software and the increasing modularity of software development and design. And then, of course, most recently, we have the spread of data analytics, made possible both by the growth of large data sets, many of which originate in the platforms and on mobile devices, and then they're increasingly amenable to analysis through the techniques of machine learning, reinforcement learning, deep learning, which we mistakenly call AI. Peter may or may not agree with me on that one, but I'm happy to debate it with him when we get to the discussion. So all of this is, what's going on now. But this is a slide that I think, really tells us where we are going. This is a slide I got from a presentation that Steve Jurvetson, the Silicon Valley venture capitalist, did at the Rotman School about 5 years ago. He said he had taken, Moore's law, which originates around 1967 or 68 with the famous prediction of Gordon Moore, and worked it back to the beginning of the 20th century. So he, or I think Ray Kurzweil had done this, but he, for their VC firm, but it basically shows the steady increase, exponential increase in the computing power, calculations per second in constant dollars that have underpinned both the computing revolution pre the digital era, and then the computing revolution from the digital revolution from the mid 1970s onwards, when digital transistors and integrated circuits really came into widespread use. And that I find this particular slide is a really nice concrete illustration of what that slide about the age of exponential growth suggests. And then this was Jurvetson's quote in the presentation I heard him give. I used to say that this is the most important graph in all the technology business. I'm now of the opinion that this is the most important graph ever graphed. And again, something open to to discussion and debate, but I increasingly am convinced he's right on that score. And then the last thing, by setting the stage, Vivek Goel, who was the vice president of research at the University of Toronto for a number of years, I worked closely with. He's now the president of the University of Waterloo, brought Mouli Eden to speak at U of T about 5 years ago now, I would say. And Eden is the former head of research for Intel in Israel. And he gave one of the most fascinating, but one of the most disturbing presentations I think I've ever heard. This was definitely in the foresight realm. He talked about the potential end of Moore's law, but saw, the exponential rate of computing power being extended through the development of new materials or the adoption of an introduction of quantum computing. So he said, even if conventional silicon isn't capable of continuing to grow at the exponential rate of Moore's law that Jurvetson's slide presents, he expected it would continue to increase through new innovations in computer technology. And then he threw out this fascinating statistic. He said, how many neurons are there in the human brain? 100 billion. He said, current transistors circa 2016, I think the presentation was 2017 or 2018. He said, currently there are 2 billion transistors on a microprocessor. But at the given rate of increase that the number of transistors on a microprocessor was increasing, he forecast 120 billion transistors on a microprocessor by 2025, 2026. I haven't actually checked to see how close we are to that in 2022. It's a little research project I need to do. And then he went on and said, no doubt humans will have embedded processors in their bodies by that point. And this, of course, is a prediction that William Gibson, the Canadian science fiction writer, made way back in his 1984 novel, The Neuromancer. Probably one of the first things that I read when I got seriously into the study of digital technology. And his final quote is one I constantly use. He said, our goal is to take the fiction out of science fiction and make it science. So that's from a technologist who knows a little bit about where things are going. And just to bring this discussion back to Intel, one of the people on the ITF webinar this morning was the current head of government corporate affairs for Intel. And he was talking about the $80 billion of capital expenditure that Intel has currently committed to onshore fabrication plants from Asia back to the United States. They're building a big fabrication complex in Ohio, another one, I think, in New Mexico. But he said they're also building a huge one or 2 huge ones, I think, in Germany at the same time to be able to fabricate in Europe as well. And he was advocating very strongly for passage of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. He said the industry needs it to equalize, to reduce the cost differential between making semiconductors and microprocessors in the U.S. versus in Southeast Asia. So this is all to set the stage of where I think the rest of the world is moving. The question of where Canada is, I turn to some of the slides that present the key insights and findings from the CCA report in 2018, competing in the global innovation economy. The bottom line for the CCA was that, and this I should add, this was the third in a series of reports that the CCA has done, starting with the first one in 2006 or 2007, when Peter Nicholson was the first president of CCA. They did a follow-up report in 2011 and 2012. The one in 2018 was the third in that series. It both built on the work of the 2 previous reports, but it if you read that report carefully, it went beyond the normal CCA mandate of just the facts, just reporting on the current state. And if you read the last two chapters of that report, between the lines, there's a lot of insight into what people on that expert panel think needs to be done. So the bottom line is Canada has deep pools of research talent. It remains a leading contributor to global research, but other countries are outpacing us in R&D investment, and they're putting our prosperity at risk. And in addition, much of Canada's investment in talent in R&D and in innovation is being capitalized upon by others, leading to a loss of economic and commercial benefits. So we're great at doing the research, but we are not always the country that takes the output of that and capitalizes on it. And if you've been anywhere near a university in the last 5 years and followed the intense debate around Huawei and Huawei's funding of research in Canada, you'll have a very clear view of what they're talking about. And I had a fascinating conversation a couple of weeks ago with a few people from CSIS. CSIS has now developed a whole wing on economic security, not just military or intelligence security, but economic security. And one of the key focuses of that wing of CSIS is to look at relations between Canadian university-based researchers and foreign companies, particularly with respect to research being done at Canadian universities that could be ultimately transferred to foreign countries and then used to develop military capabilities that would not be compatible with Canada's interests. Okay, so just moving on through some of the key insights and findings from the CCA report. We have deep pools of research talent. We compare extremely well with most other countries in terms of a research skill. We rank among the highest in terms of the population, percent of the population with tertiary degrees. So that's, we've been in that position for quite a long time. We're also recognized for our world-leading research infrastructure. And we remain a leading global contributor to research. We've maintained our standing in published research impact over the course of those 3 reports that the CCA produced. This graph summarizes the data from the initial work covering the period from 2003 to 2008 and the more recent period, 2009 to 2014. So we still rank 6th in terms of research output and the quality. And you'll notice with this red line, there was a modest increase between the 2 periods of observation. However, for our competitiveness in the innovation economy, our weaknesses are striking. This is the CCA's language. The left-hand graphic shows the top 20 subfields of research. The CCA, in its first report back in 2007, 2008, developed a composite-based index that measures the magnitude and impact and growth of research output. They use a variety of measures to do that. So the left one is the areas of strength. The right one is the areas of weakness. And you'll note that many of the things, most closely related to computer technology and future trends for computer technology are in the right-hand graphic, not in the left-hand graphic. And this summarizes some of the leading fields. So, they observe we do make, our researchers do make important contributions across a range of recent research fields. But if you look at the fields, none of those relate to the technologies that were on the first 4 slides that I highlighted on the first 4 slides that I presented you with. And just to reinforce the point, we are lagging in areas that the CCA regards as enabling and strategic technologies. We are not a world leader in emerging research fields such as bioinformatics, energy, nanotechnology, and photonics. And even in the areas where we view ourselves as leading researchers, and remember this was written and published in 2018, we've lost ground to other countries in areas such as artificial intelligence and regenerative medicine. Those are areas where obviously Canada has made massive investments, where we talk about ourselves, we present ourselves as world leaders, in the CCA verdict was that we're losing ground and losing status. And the conclusion was this may limit our ability to compete in tomorrow's global innovation economy. Then they went on from just the research side to look at how research gets translated into technological innovation. And they said the barriers there aren't barriers that impede the actual translation. This graphic, I think, is drawn from innovation surveys, which ISED does periodically with Statistics Canada. The current version it is called is the SIBS, the Strategy and Innovation Business Survey. The Survey of Innovation and Business Strategy, sorry, SIBS. And this is data, so when you take the data from the SIB survey, you see that we perform relatively well on all the types of innovation that the OECD says are important to measure. But there's a serious disconnect between what companies report on the SIB survey and what they actually do in terms of R&D. I was at a presentation of maybe 10 years ago by the former chief statistician, where he had two slides up, one based on R&D spending, one based on SIB survey. And he said this was a mystery to StatCan. They don't have an explanation for why they see that disconnect in the statistics reported from their survey. We can, I have some theories, but we can come back and that are partly linked to the methodology used in innovation surveys. We can come back and talk about that later in the discussion. And the other thing the CCA reported is that we're highly competitive internationally in providing a supportive environment for entrepreneurs and technology startups. So we are great at doing funding and doing support for startup firms. We ranked in this graphic, we ranked third. I'll show you a slide a little later that suggests we're probably, if we reproduced this slide today, we would probably rank even a little better, but we're only behind Israel and the United States in seed or early stage startup funding. We're not nearly as good in later stage venture capital. That's one of the weaknesses. However, and this is the great weakness, we are not a leading country in industrial R&D. We rank 33rd out of 40 by most measures of industrial R&D. So we're way over here, down at the end of the pack, squeezed in between Portugal and Greece on the one hand, and Spain and Romania on the other hand, none of whom would regard it as leading and dynamic countries on R&D and innovation. And the other thing they noticed, which was probably even more alarming, is in the 2011-2012 report on industrial R&D, the CCA had a really interesting analysis where they correlated the strengths in research conducted in research spending with the strengths in industrial R&D. And some of the areas that came up with strong were scientific research development services, computer systems design, communications equipment manufacturing, aerospace products and parts manufacturing. And they said spending is eroding in all of those areas of critical strength. And if you want to go back to my first 4 slides, those would be among the ones that we should be worrying the most about and regarding as the most critical to our future economic prosperity and competitiveness. So why is this the case? And this is a slide that is perhaps, in my mind, the most revealing and the most depressing. So the OECD breaks industries out into high, medium, low technology. And what the CCA report did is it looked at where Canadian R&D is concentrated. And where we lag the OECD average is in high, medium technology industries. Where we exceed the OECD average is in medium, low, and low technology average industry sectors. But even more depressing is if you look at the bottom half of the graphic, if you look at the rate of growth, our rate of growth in R&D spending is declining in the high technology industries, and the only area where we are above the line, so where growth is actually increasing, is in low technology industries. This I regard as probably the single most alarming finding in that whole CCA report. There were many alarming findings, but this is the one that I regard as most alarming. They went on and looked not only at R&D spending, but they looked at the percentage which is foreign controlled, and that line is increasing. So the amount of the percent of R&D spending controlled by foreign companies is rising in Canada. But even more alarming, and this is the refrain that you will hear again from Jim Balsillie every time he appears on Parliament Hill, and for some of my sins, I often end up on an email list where I get these presentations on Parliament Hill emailed to me, and that line is extremely alarming. So that and that line, that only goes up to 2014, and I would expect if we extended it out to the most recent data, that would, the decline would continue. And here's a summary slide that really summarizes it. So if you look at our rankings, you see this incredible decline. So we rank 8th in terms of higher education expenditure on R&D as a percent of GDP. So we are among, in the OECD countries, we are among the leaders in the amount of R&D spending that goes through public universities. We were 3rd in 2006, so there's been a decline there. Direct and indirect government support of business R&D as a percent of GDP, we ranked 15th. That was down from 4th in 2006. The number of researchers per 1,000 employment, we ranked 17th. That was down from 10th in 2006. The number of triadic patents per capita. Triadic patents are those that are registered in the US, Japan, and the EU. It's often used as a measure of the most significant patents. If the company thinks it's really valuable, they'll take it out in all 3 leading jurisdictions. So we ranked 19th. That was only down from 18th in 2006. Business expenditure on R&D, which many people often refer to, 22nd among the OECD, down from 16th. And government expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP, 24th, down from 18th. And we often, think we spend relatively high on R&D, public R&D expenditures, but in fact, we're quite low in the rankings. This is a slide that David Waters produced, which was his summary of some of the key insights and findings from the CCA report, and he kindly shared it with me at the time. So Canada produces 3.8% of world's research, but it's declined from 7th to 9th overall. The loss of innovative startups to foreign buyers The inability to grow a sufficient number of startups to scale means that Canadians do not fully capture the social and economic benefits stemming from Canadian research advances. That quote is from the CCA report. This is the areas in which we lead the world. I had that on a previous slide, and the bottom half is, shows the overall decline. That just reinforces the points that I've made on some of the previous slides. This is a slide that compares Canada more directly to other leading OECD countries. This is a slide that I took from some of Travis's work, so thank you, Travis. But it compares Canada directly on a BERD, business expenditure on research and development, as a percentage of GDP from 2001 to 2018. Most other countries show the trend, most other leading competitors show the trend line going up. Canada is the only one that shows the trend line going down. And if you were to include, China's not a member of the OECD, so that they don't show up in these rankings. But if we were to have a chart that included China, the line would be looking something like that. So clearly we are going in the exact opposite direction of where we need to be going. So the key take-home messages from the CCA report were summarized quite neatly. Canada has deep pools of research talent. We remain a leading global competitor to research, but other countries are now outpacing Canada in R&D investment, ultimately putting our prosperity at risk. Too many of our tech startups grow elsewhere, leading to a loss of economic and commercial benefits for Canada. There's an outflow of opportunity, talent, and particularly intellectual property. Momentum and reputation, innovation, performance drive the flow of talent and money, and we are losing momentum and we are losing reputation. So they posed the question. They didn't really answer it, but they posed the question in one of their slides: why is there such a bleak picture for industrial R&D in Canada? And I love this graphic because it combines three of the most depressing graphs. I've shown you all of these three previously, but this one slide that CCA put together combines the three most depressing pictures. The growing discrepancy between business spending between GERD actually in Canada and the OECD average. And if we had BERD on it, the trend line would be even lower. The increasing share of foreign-controlled intramural R&D in Canada, the declining share of patents owned in Canada, or the increasing export of Canadian patents, and then the graphic showing that the areas where we do outperform the OECD average are in medium to low and low tech industries. So why is this the case? This is a slide that I borrowed from one of Peter Nicholson's presentations. We did a number of us did a presentation for an innovation symposium that the IRPP organized in Ottawa in 2018. And Peter did one of his usually totally depressing presentations. He's published the analysis and the argument in a number of places. He did a summary report for CCA around 2012 or 2013. I believe the title is Paradox Lost. He did a very interesting piece in special issue of Canadian Public Policy, I think in late 2016. And then coming out of this IRPP conference, for anybody who's interested, he produced a very interesting overview paper for the IRPP, which you can find on the IRPP website. But collectively, you look at those four things, they all make the same basic point. So this slide, I like this slide because it looks at comparative advantage and complementary comparative advantage, Canada and the US. So where's our comparative advantage in extraction and in processing? Where are we weakest? In tech intensive industries? That just provides a graphic illustration of the point from the previous slide from the CCA report. And Peter argues that the US has historically been by far the dominant provider of innovation to Canada through trade flows and foreign direct investment. And I did my undergraduate education at Carleton, and I remember at the time, one of the leading student economists of technology who will remain nameless in the Carleton Economics Department used to make the argument that this was good for Canada because we didn't have to spend the money on R&D ourselves. We just automatically benefited from the free flow of R&D into Canadian firms through US multinationals. Peter argues as well that Canadian business culture and behavior reflect this long-standing dependence on US innovation, and the limited size of the domestic market necessitates strong policy support to level the playing field. This point is critical. It's a point that Richard Harris made really strongly in a monograph he wrote for the MacDonald Royal Commission in 1985, Trade, Industrial Organization and Competitiveness. I wrote an introduction to a new edition of it that the Carleton Library put out in 2016. That I think is the single most ignored innovation-related piece of work in Canadian policy history for the last 30 to 40 years. I'll, again, happy to come back and talk about Harris's argument. So a profitable, and Peter concludes, it's a profitable symbiosis for both sides, which has endured. This is another way of summarizing what the previous slides have shown. Unfortunately, the colors that they use don't show up the easiest, but a group at Harvard produces something called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. They produce another slide, which I didn't include on the composition of trade. I think if Dave's on the talk now, I think Dave has used the trade slide in some of his presentations that I saw. But the relative size of the boxes shows the sectors of the economy where Canada's trade is the highest. The colors, but then they go on and they do a calculation on the technological complexity of the sectors. And the bottom line is that this shows in much greater detail, it illustrates graphically in much greater detail the problem reflected in that slide from the CCA report. Our exports are strongest in the low technology sectors, except for automobiles and motor vehicle parts, and maybe medical, certain medical things and gas turbines. We're relatively low in more technologically sophisticated exports, and we are relatively weak. Even in the areas where we export a certain amount, we're relatively weak. A negative sign shows that we're below average in technological complexity of that sector of the economy. A green with a positive sign signifies we're above average in technological complexity. Maybe spacecraft is one, but not horribly above the line. Polymers and ethylene, another. Because of the industrial complex in Sarnia. But overall, this is a pretty depressing picture in terms of the technological complexity of our export economy. And, we are overwhelmingly an export economy in Canada. So why is this the case? This is a slide that I borrowed from Travis, who in turn has borrowed it from the OECD. if you look at, we stand out among the OECD countries in the extent to which we rely on indirect tax-based supports for R&D. This goes back to the origins of the shred, first under the Trudeau government, the first Trudeau government in 1982-83, and then ultimately revised and refined by the Mulroney government in '84 because of some of the tax scams that originated with the first version of the shred. But that has remained the center point of Canadian R&D policy. Now, you'll see a slight decline in the level of tax support that, from around 2012 to 2013. I think that is a result of the Jenkins report and the recommendation which the federal government acted on, the Harper government acted on, to take capital spending out of shred and just focus shred on labor spending. But, the ratio is still, much stronger on the indirect tax R&D, the tax support for R&D as opposed to the direct spending. And I will come back to that in a moment. This is a slide, this is the same slide I showed before. GERD is a percentage of R&D, but David Waters has very creatively superimposed on this graphic, the sorry history of innovation strategies in Canada over the last 20 years. And I copied David's depictions and superimposed this on the OECD slide, just to show, we've had a rolling series of innovation strategies in the last 20 years, all designed to rectify this problem. And the result is we continue to be moving in the wrong direction. So the question to be asking ourselves is, what is wrong, not with the top half of the picture, but with the bottom half of the picture? We are, and I should have added the innovation and skills strategy that this Trudeau government introduced in the 2017-2018 budgets. So we are clearly not doing something correct. And I believe it was Albert Einstein who said, the definition of stupidity is to consistently repeat the same action and expect a different outcome. And nothing that I've seen illustrates that more clearly than this particular graphic. However, the one area in which I note some slight cause for optimism is the trend lines on the growth of VC investment in Canada and the emergence of the emergence of growing technology companies. This was the slide, Peter, that I was just adding at 1:45. So Tech Toronto, which is an organization, tech organization in Toronto that both Travis and I have worked with in the past, has put together a list. You can see it at the bottom. They call it the 3 Comma Club. And they put out, I got a newsletter from them today where they put out their latest results. They quote the latest figures from the CVCA. 2021 was a banner year for VC investment in Canada. A total of 14.7 billion was invested, with 72 mega deals and 8 VC-backed IPOs. But it was also a record year for companies entering what they call the 3 Comma Club, which is unicorns, I think growing unicorns, public unicorns, still private unicorns, and what they call soonicorns, but companies that they view are on the cusp of becoming unicorns. And you can find that list on the TechTO website. I've included the URL at the bottom. So that's the one bright sign. The question that I think we need to be asking is, are there enough of them? Are they growing fast enough? And is it enough to offset, to counteract all the other trends that I've been documenting so far? So what do we need to do? So I'm going to summarize some of the things I've written over the last 3 to 4 years. three reports that I've done. The first is called a digital strategy for Canada. It was produced for IRPP as Insight Report number 25 in February 2019. So almost, I'm not so good at the math, that's 4 years ago. And some of the things that I argued for is that we should be using the industry strategy tables to devise true sector strategies in key industry sectors, particularly the ones where the CCA report said we were weakest. And I have long argued that we need to go back and redevelop the capability that it existed at Industry Canada in the late 90s, early 2000s to develop technology roadmaps. If anybody knows the history of the semiconductor industry in the US and Semitech when it was created in the mid-late 80s, one of the critical things it did was use technology roadmaps to provide a way forward for US semiconductor companies to help overcome the gap with Japan and get the US semiconductor industry right-sided and on the right path. And I think, and I've seen that suggestion now come up in several different contexts over the last year or so, that would suggest to me, the time is right for doing that. We need to devise a scale-up strategy for global expansion, and I'm going to go into that in more detail on the next slide. We need to develop what my colleagues Dan Bresnitz and Darius Ornstein have called in a series of 4 papers they've published in the last few years. 3 are journal articles, 1 is in an OECD collection. I'm happy to provide the references or the papers for anybody who wants. But they describe a Schumpeterian development agency as a peripheral agency, not primarily aligned with a federal department, but with a mandate and a relatively small budget, but a mandate to really drive innovation through the economy. And their latest version of this paper has a typology of 8 different agencies and countries they've studied. We need to implement an effective IP strategy to secure Canadian IP in Canada to reverse the flow of IP. Oh, and I just on the Schumpeterian Development Agency, this, DARPA is one of the ones that they talk about in their papers, but my view increasingly, Dan has an article in the Globe and Mail from November, December, saying DARPA is not what we need in Canada. I know that the Public Policy Forum has been and the Business Council have been pushing this very strongly on the federal government. There's all sorts of arguments as to why, CARPA may not work as well in Canada as DARPA is working in the US. But even more critically is that's, we're fighting a 1960 battle there. DARPA was created in the US around 1960. The current Senate bill that I'm talking about is calling for something entirely new. It's what they call a Directorate for Technology and Innovation that is to be housed in the National Science Foundation, but it would have a mandate for strengthening the leadership of the United States in critical technologies and addressing and mitigating the technology challenges that are integral to the geostrategic position of the United States. So we're looking at what the US did 60 years ago and talking about emulating it. And we're not looking at what the US is, what the bills are that are in the US Congress today and what they're considering doing today. So again, happy to talk more about that. We need to create an effective national data strategy, secure data rights in international trade agreements, not the USMCA. Anybody who knows a bit about the negotiations for the USMCA knows that our negotiators were almost completely focused on protecting the automotive sector. And a few natural resource sectors. We completely ignored high technology issues and IP and data issues, and we let the Americans roll over the entire chapters from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which we had rejected. We let them roll that over into the USMCA. And if you actually read the chapters on IP and data in the USMCA, they are a disaster for Canada. We need to strengthen our regional innovation systems, develop a true cluster strategy. And by that, I do not mean a super cluster strategy. I'm happy to, Travis has done some interesting work on that. I have my own views on it. We need to work on the cluster map work that I said did, and work that has been done through the RDAs, the regional development agencies, and supporting clusters. And this report is available online from the IRPP. The second thing I want to draw upon, and I am getting near the end of this, is a paper that I did with Travis and Stephen Denny on the policy preferences of scale-up firms. We talked to somewhere between 80 and 100 scale-up firms we worked with through the Council of Canadian Innovators, and we summarized the key insights and findings. So if you go back to the earlier slide, I said we're really good at supporting startup firms. We're not nearly as good at supporting scale-up firms. We set out in this research to try to find out what the scale-up entrepreneurs thought about this. They strongly prefer, in contrast to Canada's indirect tax-based support for R&D, they strongly prefer more targeted, focused policy support. They view our policy mix as too neutral, relying too much on tax policy instruments, and support is spread too evenly across all sectors and firm type size. Howard Alper, the former head of STIC, said something to me at a meeting I was at about 6 or 7 years ago that really summarized the shortcoming of SHRED. He said SHRED is blind. The administrators at Revenue Canada, all they do is judge whether the company applying for a SHRED grant meets the criteria set out in the legislation. They know nothing about the quality of the company, the quality of the research being done, or the strategic importance of that research for Canada's competitive position. And our scale-up entrepreneurs seem to agree. They favor direct grants over indirect tax incentives. We need to make more effective use of procurement policies. I could tell countless stories about this, but I'll save them for the discussion. This is a quote from one of the entrepreneurs that we interviewed. We are at the beginning of a new technology war for the digital space, and they viewed the use of procurement as critical for that. And then, I've been saying this for a long time, about 10 years coming out of our research. We need a strategy to deploy long-term patient investment capital into the high technology sector. There are no shortages of pools of capital. When I worked in the Ontario government, we worked on a proposal for the Ontario Innovation Fund. One of the things I came away from with that was there's no shortage of investment capital in this country. There are enormous pools of capital in the pension funds, and increasingly since the 1990s in private equity funds. But it's not being deployed overwhelmingly into, some of it's being deployed into VC, but it's not being deployed into creating pools that can keep Canadian high technology startup and scale up firms in Canadian hands. Again, happy to talk more about that. And we need a more refined talent strategy to provide strategic skills that these companies need to grow. We've focused on the immigration side. We've some of the policy measures introduced by the Trudeau government, make it much easier for technology companies to bring in talent with strategic skills that they need to grow. But we need to take that approach and apply it to the whole education and training system to make sure we're training enough of the people with the skills that those companies need to grow. And that publication is also available on the IPL website. And the last thing is just derived from this work I just completed for ISED, the Market Policy Support Branch at ISED. So we need an enhanced role for the Competition Bureau to deal with the challenge that mostly US-based platform firms pose for Canadian SMEs and scale-up firms. We need to ensure equitable trade terms for Canadian SMEs as purchasers of business services when they're dealing with the GAFAM firms, Google, now Alphabet, Apple, Facebook, now Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft. We need to invigorate competition in markets for the provision of digital services to Canadian businesses where GAFAM firms are incumbents. We need to closely scrutinize the acquisition of Canadian scale-up firms by GAFAM firms. And again, the same point as the previous slide, use existing capital pools to keep domestic scale-ups in Canada, keep Canadian talent in Canada, and expand the supply of critical skills, and support IP and the data management strategies. And I end that report by asking the question of, do we need a Canadian version of a Digital Markets Act, which is what the Europeans are introducing, or the American Competition Innovation Online Act? Senator Amy Klobuchar has introduced a version of this in the Senate. There's a slightly different version introduced last year into the House of Representatives. There's probably about 4 other acts that have been introduced in the Senate. This one, ACIO, is probably the most important because it was reported out of the Senate Judiciary Committee back to the Senate as a whole in February. So there's a chance that the Senate might actually act on that one. That's it for me. Thank you for your patience. Went on a little bit too long, but hopefully you found it interesting, and I look forward to questions. I'm going to stop the screen share now. Peter, should I stop recording?
Yes, if you would do that, David, I'd appreciate that. And thank you very much for your presentation. I think you provided some very interesting historical context and a prescription for some of the future, but maybe we'll have